Hi everyone, it's me here. So the first thing we need to establish is what we are working towards. What is the current national grid mix? Well, here in the UK, this graph from Ofgem shows us that in 2021, coal made up 2% of our electricity generation, gas 40%, nuclear 16%, renewables 24%, and other sources like oil, biomass, and waste 9%. It is worth noting that within the gas figure, most of that is accounted for by gas-fueled combined cycle gas turbines, or CCGT. These are very efficient, gas-fired power stations, which can be ramped up and down quickly to follow demand. They make up over 35% of the UK's total installed capacity, but their output has been falling as more variable renewable energy comes on stream. Last year, gas provided about 1/5 of the UK's electricity, but at a much higher cost than wholesale electricity prices. This is because the gas has to be shipped in from abroad, often at very short notice. Unlike the UK's North Sea gas fields, which have been depleted, and with wholesale electricity prices at record highs, there is a big incentive to get off gas. This was highlighted when Russia invaded Ukraine last year and wholesale gas prices rose tenfold. However, while we might be able to replace gas with other sources for electricity, there is still a big role for gas in heating homes and businesses. In fact, all of the heat we use comes from burning something, whether that be gas, coal, or wood. There's also the industrial processes that require heat, such as steel making, cement making, and the production of hydrogen. So, onto the question, why build new nuclear? Well, the main reason is reliability. Unlike solar and wind power, nuclear power stations produce electricity at a steady rate, whatever the weather. Another reason is carbon emissions. Nuclear power stations don't emit carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases which cause global warming. Although there are emissions associated with building and decommissioning the power stations themselves, as well as the processing of used fuel, overall they have much lower carbon emissions per megawatt-hour than any of the fossil fuels. Additionally, unlike fossil fuel plants, nuclear power stations have very small sites with relatively small ecological footprints compared to the amount of electricity they generate. We'll see this in more detail later. The UK's first new nuclear power station in a generation is Hinkley C near Bridgewater in Somerset on the southwest coast. It is an EPR, or European Pressurized Reactor, designed by French company Areva, and construction started back in 2013. It was originally expected to be completed in 2025 with a budget of £18 billion. But after many delays and cost overruns, it's now not due to be finished until 2027, with the total cost forecast to be around £23 billion. This means that the cost of building the plant has increased from £1.19 billion per gigawatt-hour of electricity generated to £1.7 billion per gigawatt-hour. To put that into context, the latest offshore wind farms come in at just £0.6 billion per hour, whilst onshore wind is less than half that at £0.27 billion per gigawatt-hour. This high cost is the main reason why nuclear power remains so unpopular. That said, once operational, Hinkley C should run for 60 years, producing enough electricity for 6 million homes. This will also help phase out the UK's remaining coal plants. The nuclear power station will use 3.2 million litres of water from the Bristol Channel each day to keep the reactor cool. Now, this could potentially have an impact on local marine life. However, the area is very tidally influenced, and the cooling water is returned heated to the same place it was taken from, which in turn warms the surrounding waters. This is good news for some species such as sea bass and plaice, which prefer warmer waters. As a result, The plan is to supplement these fish stocks by introducing new species such as oysters, mussels, and sea bream. There are also birds of prey, such as ospreys, which are being encouraged by the creation of 6 artificial nest platforms. But what about the waste? Well, the spent fuel rods will be stored on site in a wet store for 50 years before being transferred to a dry store. Eventually, the plan is to reprocess the fuel and then ship the waste to a geological repository in northern Finland, but this may take several hundred years. The second plant under construction is Sizewell C in Suffolk on the east coast. This is another EPR, although it uses a simplified design based on the one used at Hinkley Point. Construction started in 2022 and it's due for completion in 2032 at an estimated cost of £20 billion. That's about £1.87 billion per gigawatt hour. Interestingly, Sizewell already has a twin reactor site next to it, and this was the country's first nuclear power station. Work started in 1966, and it began generating electricity in 1976. When it was finally shut down in 2024, it had produced 20 times more electricity than it took to build. The newer Sizewell C will also produce enough electricity for about 6 million homes. In addition to these 2 large projects, there are 2 smaller modular reactors under development. Bradwell B in Essex is a joint venture between the Chinese state-owned China General Nuclear. The plan is to build a new nuclear power station on the site of the former coal-fired power station. The station will consist of 4 700-megawatt molten salt reactors housed within 2 1450-megawatt units. Molten salt reactors have a number of advantages over traditional nuclear reactors. Firstly, the fuel is in a liquid molten salt compound rather than solid pellet. This allows for more efficient extraction of energy from the fuel itself, and hence, higher thermal efficiencies. Furthermore, the fuel can be extracted from the reactor if there is a problem, whereas in traditional reactors, the fuel would have to be moved away from the reactor using robotic arms. And this is what happened in Japan at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. Finally, the liquid fuel is cooled by the salt compound, rather than water, meaning that the liquid fuel cannot turn into steam and explode. Therefore, there is no risk of a meltdown, which makes these reactors inherently safer. The aim is to build the prototype unit by the early 2030s, followed by full-scale deployment from the late 2030s. Lastly, there is the Oldbury site in Gloucestershire. Again, this is on the site of a former coal-fired power station. Here, the plan is to build to 470 megawatt units, using Canadian-designed Darlington new nuclear reactors. These are small modular reactors, which means that they can be built in a factory and then transported to the site. One advantage of the Darlington new nuclear reactor is that it uses natural circulation, which means that there are no pumps required to circulate the coolant. This simplifies the system and therefore reduces the risk of component failure. Again, work on this will start in the early 2030s, with the first unit coming online in the early 2040s. So, how much power do we need? Well, the UK currently generates about 300 terawatt-hours per year. The Committee on Climate Change estimates that we will need 400 terawatt-hours per year by 2050. This is due to a number of factors, including population growth, economic growth, and the electrification of transport and heating. A lot of this additional power will come from new offshore wind, which has been shown to be extremely cost-effective. However, this is variable and intermittent, unlike nuclear. Therefore, nuclear power stations can provide the reliable baseload power that we need to keep the lights on. Additionally, as mentioned earlier, nuclear power stations have a very small ecological footprint. For instance, Sizewell C will cover about 300 acres or 120 hectares of land. which is about 0.35 square kilometers. This is equivalent to about 125 football pitches, and yet it will produce 3.2 gigawatts of electricity. In contrast, the world's largest solar farm, the 2.2 gigawatt Al-Qasr Solar in Abu Dhabi, covers about 2,000 football pitches to generate 2.2 gigawatts of electricity. However, the biggest driver for nuclear power is probably getting rid of the gas-fueled CCGT. As mentioned earlier, these account for over 35% of the UK's installed electricity generation capacity. The oldest of these plants were built in the 1960s and 70s, and were originally meant to be used as a peaking plant to provide electricity during periods of high demand, such as in winter. However, the gas price shocks of the 1970s and 80s led to a proliferation of these plants, as well as the building of coal-fired plants. The UK went from having 200 TWh of CCGT capacity in 1973 to 700 TWh in 1980. But things really took off in the 1990s after the UK's gas storage facilities were depleted. Since then, the amount of gas we've had to import has increased tenfold. By 2008, CCGTs accounted for over 50% of the UK's installed capacity, and while this has fallen to 37% today, it's still too much in my opinion. Having low-carbon nuclear power will allow us to get rid of these plants without increasing the amount of installed capacity. After all, why would we want to have lots of spare capacity? Electricity is not like petrol, where you need lots of spare capacity in case of an emergency. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You want to reduce the amount of spare capacity as much as possible, and then use demand-side measures and energy storage to balance supply and demand. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.